Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Baltimore, Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.
I'm Aaron Maté, sitting in for Jimmy Dore, here with Scott Horton. He is author of the book Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Well, Scott, we recently got a new revelation on how this war was provoked from Jeffrey Sachs. He is a well-known academic. He's been on the Jimmy Dore show before and a leading critic of the proxy war in Ukraine. And speaking recently in Europe, he detailed a conversation that he had with Jake Sullivan, who was the national security advisor under Joe Biden right before Russia invaded. And this is what Jeffrey Sachs said.
15th, 2021, I had an hour call with Jake Sullivan in the White House begging, Jake, avoid the war. You can avoid the war. All you have to do is say NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. And he said to me, oh, NATO's not going to enlarge to Ukraine. Don't worry about it. I said, Jake, say it publicly. No, we can't say it publicly. Say, Jake, you're going to have a war over something that isn't even going to happen? He said, don't worry, Jeff, there will be no war.
That's Jeffrey Sachs detailing a conversation he had with Jake Sullivan back in December 2021, urging him to say simply that Ukraine will not join NATO. And Jake Sullivan admitting privately that that's not going to happen, but we're not going to say it. Ukraine will not join NATO, but we're not going to say it publicly. And we know what happened next. We got a war. So let me bring in Scott Horton, author of the book Provoked. Scott, first of all, can you explain this contradiction between Jake Sullivan privately admitting that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, but then refusing to say that publicly, and in fact, publicly insisting that one day Ukraine will join NATO?
Mm-hmm. You know, my friend David Hardy, who wrote the best book about the Waco massacre, he had been a former federal cop. And he said that when you're in the national government, the way it works is there's the truth, there's falsity, and then there's our position. And our position is the one that they all agreed upon in committee and wrote down on a piece of paper and are now married to, though the heavens fall. And for example, we're just back in the moderate rebels in Syria, but there's suicide bombers everywhere. Yeah, but that's our position and we're sticking with it. And so that was the same kind of thing here. Our position is that we have an open door. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't really mean anything. There's no door, right? It's just jargon. It means that we say that no third country can tell us not to bring any second country into our military alliance. So of course we're not bringing Ukraine into NATO. Are you crazy? That could cause a war with Russia. Hell, and they're so corrupt, their economy and their democracy are so corrupt, there's no way in the world we could bring them into NATO. But you can't tell us that we can't bring them into NATO. And yes, they go to war with you before we give in on that. The door stays open. And so it doesn't matter. And Biden himself, as much as any of them, reaffirmed repeatedly that he really had no intention of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And I think that that Putin probably believed him on that too, but he was just saying, fine, then put it in writing so that hopefully the next guy won't just tear it up. It'll make it more difficult to change the policy back to this one that's hostile to them. And so that's really all that he had to do. And as I know that you know, in rehearsing all this history, that Derek Chollet, who is a longtime Democratic State Department apparatchik, had said in a podcast that when they met with the Russians in January and February of 22, that they just refused to discuss NATO other than to say NATO is defensive. And this has just been the mantra this whole time. In fact, 3 weeks after they brought in the final ceremony, brought Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary into NATO in 1999, they launched an aggressive war against Serbia. right?
Right.
They launched what was essentially an aggressive war against Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan. The Taliban didn't do 9/11. They let Al-Qaeda go and attack the Taliban instead, basically, in that war. And so they invoked Article 5, but that's a lie. And then they lied us all into Libya, pretending that it was a defensive war to help the poor civilians, and lied the Russians into it, made a chump out of the President Medvedev at the time for believing them, that we're just trying to create a no-fly zone to protect the civilians, which they used as cover to launch a 9-month regime change war. NATO flying air cover for Al-Qaeda to overthrow the government in Tripoli. And so, of course, it's not a purely defensive alliance, and they've proven it thrice. And yet they say that, and you're just supposed to accept it. And the Russians had made it clear that that's not good enough. But the Americans just, and you know what, too? You know, I'm sorry, I always sound like I'm making excuses for these guys. I don't mean to, but it seems relevant that, you know, as Stephen Walt wrote at the time, the famous realist school foreign policy theorist, he said, essentially, these people are looking at the wrong page of the textbook. Like, I don't know, I didn't go to Georgetown or any of this crap, but he's saying, listen, you guys are on this appeasement deterrence model thing, invoking Hitler and all that. But that's not what it is. This is the spiral model, where both sides think that they're on the defensive and both sides are making essentially reasonable defensive claims, but they refuse to take the other side's defensive acts as defensive and see them only as offensive. And so they keep spiraling up the tension when what they need is to everybody just take a break and try to ramp things down, which he said at the time absolutely could be done. But they just refuse to listen to that. And I think a big part of this is, and this is, you know, the whole foreign policy establishment is guilty of this, but especially Joe Biden, and especially in his very way too old age as president at that time, just had to fall back on and rely on these cheap historical analogies about World War II. He can't really talk in depth about what's going on in Ukraine, right? But he can say Churchill was right and Neville Chamberlain was too weak. And you got to punch the bully in the nose, and just, you know, these kind of cliches from the Second World War. And so in this case, Putin is Hitler, and that means that he can definitely not be Chamberlain, which, by the way, is Chamberlain that gave Poland the war guarantee, not Churchill. But anyway.
Well, to me, this isn't just, you know, hubris and, you know, Biden and the establishment's reflexive hostility to diplomacy, to like basically doing anything that can possibly accommodate anybody, especially Russia, who they despise from the Cold War. That's a big element. There's also, though, something very cynical here, because the open door to Ukraine gave NATO a backdoor to fight Russia, because by promising future membership to Ukraine far off in the future, you can use that future promise to integrate Ukraine militarily into NATO without giving it the membership that would obligate NATO to defend it if it gets attacked. And that's what happened. Ukraine was, throughout the course of this, you know, through these years of it being promised NATO, ever since 2008, when George W. Bush and Dick Cheney pushed it through, Ukraine was integrated militarily further into NATO. There are all these agreements. There was increased training. And, you know, the U.S. was on the ground. Like, we learned last year that the CIA built a number of bases inside of Ukraine on Russia's border in the years after the 2014 coup. So it's the worst of all worlds for Ukraine, because basically NATO gets to use you to fight Russia and like flood you with equipment, but without giving you the commitment to come defend you if Russia ultimately fights back. And that's exactly what has happened.
Exactly right. And Aaron, look, it's you and me and 50 experts from all the big universities and the Council on Foreign Relations, and everybody used that exact same phrase that you just used. It's the worst of all worlds. Why would you do this? It's just you and him fight. We, as you said, interoperability. What that really means is making, essentially standardizing Ukraine's military, so that obviously in the hypothetical that NATO went to war against the Russian Federation, Ukraine's military would be just another military auxiliary under the NATO Supreme Allied Command, along with Germany and Hungary and the Baltics and everybody else. And so, but we promise, as you just said, we promise we'll defend them, but not you. Now, the Hawks say that, yeah, see, W. Bush should have gone ahead over Angela Merkel's dead body, and he should have just given them a war guarantee right then and there in 2008, and that would have solved this problem. But I don't think that's right. I think that they're assuming too much. I think that if they had moved to bring Ukraine into NATO then, that first of all, they wouldn't be able to do it in one day. Bush couldn't just declare Article 5 like that. It doesn't work like that. And I think that the Russians would have moved immediately then to, as Mearsheimer warned, Walt's counterpart, John Mearsheimer warned then, to wreck Ukraine, to make sure that America could not take it. And that's what they would do. And that's what they would have done then if the issue had been pushed that far then. So the people who say it was the worst of all worlds, that's exactly right. But the answer is W. Bush should have never done that. They should have. And Aaron, as I show in the book, even the expanders all along, from Richard Holbrooke, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Henry Kissinger, and the people who were at the vanguard of pushing for NATO expansion over the last 30 years, they all said, of course, we have to make a special exception for Ukraine. You'd be crazy to try to take Ukraine away from Russia. That'll cause a war. We don't want that. So they all propose what we already know how to do. The Austria model or the Finland model from the last Cold War, where they're not part of NATO and they're not part of the Warsaw Pact and they're not occupied by foreign troops. And
that's what most Ukrainians wanted, according to polls, forever.
Yeah. And it was in their constitution until America changed their government because they kept voting wrong.
Yep.
And so they really ruined it. And that's why I feel perfectly comfortable. I mean, the book is a polemic in a way, but I feel perfectly comfortable saying that Washington provoked this war. People sometimes say that I'm saying that Kiev provoked it. And of course they played their role, but no, it was Washington that really put them in this position. If you think about it as in terms that they use, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the grand chessboard, Europe is the chessboard, America and Russia are playing chess. Ukraine at best is a square. It might even be one of the little horsies or something, but it's not the player of the game, right? They're being manipulated in this whole thing.
Well, on that note, Scott, let's go to a clip of Zelensky basically admitting what you're saying, where Zelensky admitted that he played along with Jake Sullivan's con. Jeffrey Sachs talked about Jake Sullivan telling him, yeah, Ukraine's not joining NATO, but we're just not going to say that publicly. Well, Zelensky admitted that he was told that too by the Biden administration, and he played along with it as well. This is Zelensky speaking back in March 2020.
Them personally to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO in a year or 2 or 5. Just say it directly and clearly, or just say no. And the response was very clear. You're not going to be a NATO or EU member, but publicly the doors will remain open.
So you hear that?
Yep.
Zelensky says he was told you're not going to be a NATO member, but publicly the doors will remain open. So what he was told is that, yes, we are conning everybody, including you, because we're giving you an invitation we have no intention to fulfill. And Zelensky played along with it to the point where he was not willing to take NATO off the table before Russia invaded. And after it invaded, he finally admitted that he was in on the con. The question is, how do you think history will judge him, Scott? I mean, now he's losing the support, it looks like, of his major patron, the U.S., if you believe everything that Trump is saying. So what do you think will be Zelensky's legacy when all is said and done?
Well, I don't think of him as criminal as Joe Biden in the situation. I think he made a lot of bad decisions in a bad situation himself. It's hard for me to measure really the relative power of a guy like that and what freedom of action he ever really has. He was elected on peace in 2019. And one of the first things that happened was that Donald Trump's ambassador, William Taylor, told him, don't sign that peace deal.
That's right.
This was the Steinmeier formula. And I don't know if Trump was even in on that, but this was,
this was when the Democrats were gearing up to impeach Trump for pausing weapons to Ukraine. And at the same time as that was happening, William Taylor was telling Zelensky, don't worry about implementing the Minsk Accords.
That's right. And of course they said, what holdup of weapons? We didn't notice any holdup of weapons. And so this Steinmeier formula essentially was a new order of operations for implementing the thing, because nobody could agree on which order the different pieces of the deal could be implemented, even though really it was clear and the Americans and Ukrainians were being intransigent. But so the Germans were trying to break this deadlock by coming up with this deal, and Zelensky wanted to sign it. And, as people often note, he's Jewish, which means he's not ethnically Russian and he's not ethnically Ukrainian. But he's also from Kharkiv, which is in the east, but not all the way the furthest east from Donetsk, right? And a Russian speaker didn't speak Ukrainian, and there are a great many Ukrainians who don't speak Ukrainian, and that's a legacy of just history and geography, but also the communist policy of really Russianizing the language and marginalizing Ukrainian. But so he was in a position, and I don't know how many votes he even got in the far east of the country. Were they even allowed to participate in the election in 2019 to a very great degree? I don't believe that they were. And he was still with a sound majority anyway.
Yeah, the rebel-controlled areas of the Donbass were not, but the rest were, and there was a huge amount of support from there. I just spoke to a Ukrainian historian who was so excited about Zelensky because he was promising to bring peace. And although he did take, as you talk about in your book, he took some initial steps towards that because he didn't have the support of the U.S., who in fact undermined the peace process inside Ukraine. That helped put him on the path to war. Oh, and
in fact, I cite in that part of the book, I cite your great work about his friend, the comedian who went up there and was trying to do a unity type deal down there in Mariupol and was marginalized, and his friend, the president, left him high and dry. He was
attacked. His comedian friend, was attacked by the Azov battalion, members of that political movement, for trying to promote peace. And then so Zelensky fired him shortly after that because Zelensky bowed to the neo-Nazis, just as he bowed to Washington, and the rest is history.
They call it the No to Capitulation movement. And
exactly.
I also cite in the book, Aaron, you're in the book a lot. You did this great interview with Stephen Cohen in I don't know, 16 or 17 or 18 or something, where he said to you that, listen, what this may have even been, was it in 18? Was it still in Portland?
It was in October 2019, right when Democrats were obsessed with impeaching Trump for positive.
So it was Zelensky. It was after Poroshenko. I couldn't remember if y'all were discussing the former or the latter there.
Yeah,
but and then what he said was, what this president needs is bodyguards. He needs American help to arrest the leaders and the most dangerous neo-Nazis so that he can pursue peace without worrying that they're going to murder him, because Dmitry Yarosh and Andrei Beletsky, for two, had threatened to kill him repeatedly already. And as even the New York Times said, hey, these are credible threats. This isn't just like some jerk threatening the president out from somewhere. This is, in the United States, where they would never get near the president. Well, usually, I don't know if it's Donald Trump, maybe they would. But most of the time, no one threatening the president would get anywhere near him. But in Ukraine, that's not really the situation. These people have overthrown the government twice, and they could do it again. And so this was a real threat. And as Stephen Cohen told you, they just need a little help from their American friends to marginalize the leaders of the most radical right so that they can pursue peace. And that's, of course, exactly what they did not get.
Scott Horton, author of the book Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Scott, thank you very much for joining us today on the Jimmy Dore Show.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron.
Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Baltimore, Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.